In a fiery congressional hearing, Senator J.D. Vance dares to challenge Representative Jasmine Crockett, accusing her of mismanaging urban housing funds, only to face her razor-sharp legal mind and unyielding resolve. The congressional hearing room buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation as cameras focused on the two figures at the center of the storm. Senator J.D. Vance, his jaw set and eyes narrowed, leaned forward in his seat, ready to launch his attack. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her posture calm but her gaze steely, a woman who had faced far worse than political posturing and lived to tell the tale. The topic was federal housing funds, a lifeline for millions struggling to keep a roof over their heads, and Crockett had been a relentless advocate for expanding the program. Vance, however, saw an opportunity to score points, to paint her as a reckless idealist pushing for funds that would be squandered in mismanaged urban districts. What he didn't expect was that Crockett was ready, armed not just with data, but with a fire forged in personal struggle. Vance began with a calculated jab, his voice dripping with condescension. "Representative Crockett, your push for billions in housing funds ignores the reality on the ground," he said, his words slicing through the room. "Urban areas, particularly those under leadership like yours, have a track record of waste and corruption. Why should taxpayers foot the bill for more of the same?" The accusation landed like a grenade, and murmurs rippled through the room. It was a familiar narrative, one that pinned poverty and decay on the supposed failures of Black and brown communities, and Vance wielded it like a weapon. He leaned back, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, confident he'd set the tone. But Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses, her movements deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Senator Vance, let's talk about reality," she began, her tone measured but laced with an edge that made the room go still. "You speak of waste, but you ignore the decades of disinvestment that gutted these communities. You point fingers at urban leadership, yet you're silent on the rural towns in your own backyard, where families are just as desperate for housing." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Poverty isn't a city problem or a rural problem. It's a policy problem, and it's time we stop playing games with people's lives." The room felt electric, every eye locked on Crockett as she leaned forward, her voice rising with conviction. She wasn't just defending her position, she was dismantling Vance's entire narrative. "Let me tell you something personal," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I've known what it's like to face eviction, to wonder if you'll have a home tomorrow. That's not a moral failure. It's a system that's failing us." Her words hit like a thunderclap, raw and unfiltered, and even Vance seemed momentarily caught off guard. Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a woman who'd lived the consequences of the policies they were debating, and she wasn't here to be lectured. She pulled out a stack of papers, slamming them onto the table for emphasis. "These are the numbers, Senator," she said, her voice now a force of nature. "Since the 1980s, federal housing investment has dropped by over 60%, while rents have skyrocketed. You want to talk about waste? How about the waste of human potential when families are forced onto the streets?" The data was her shield, but her passion was her sword, and she wielded both with precision. Vance shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence waning as Crockett pressed on, her words painting a vivid picture of systemic neglect that transcended geography or race. The hearing was no longer just a policy debate. It was a battle of wills, a clash between Vance's calculated rhetoric and Crockett's unyielding truth. She turned the tables, challenging him directly. "You've written about the struggles of rural America, Senator," she said, her voice sharp. "So why do you pretend those same struggles don't exist in cities? Why do you divide us when the pain is the same?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Vance's face tightened. The room was on edge, waiting for his response, but Crockett wasn't done. She was just getting started, and the fire in her eyes promised a reckoning. The congressional hearing crackled with raw energy, every word a spark threatening to ignite the room. Representative Jasmine Crockett's challenge to Senator J.D. Vance still echoed, her piercing question about his selective empathy hanging like a guillotine. Vance's face, taut with barely concealed frustration, betrayed a man unaccustomed to being cornered. The audience, from lawmakers to reporters, leaned forward, sensing the shift in power. Crockett's unyielding truth had turned the tables, and Vance's calculated rhetoric was unraveling under her scrutiny. She stood poised, her eyes locked on him, daring him to respond. The silence was suffocating, but it was clear. This was no longer just about housing funds. It was a fight for the soul of the narrative. Vance cleared his throat, his voice tight as he attempted to regain control. "Representative Crockett, I don't deny the struggles in cities," he said, his tone clipped. "But let's not pretend leadership doesn't matter. Urban districts have had decades of mismanagement, and throwing money at the problem won't fix it." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You talk about systemic issues, but what about accountability? What about the leaders who failed their communities?" The accusation was a desperate counterpunch, an attempt to redirect the blame back to Crockett and her allies. He was doubling down, painting her as a defender of broken systems, and the room buzzed with renewed tension. Crockett's lips twitched, not in amusement, but in defiance. She wasn't about to let him wriggle free. "Accountability, Senator?" she shot back, her voice a low, controlled burn. "Let's talk about that. Who's accountable for the redlining that locked Black and brown families out of wealth building? Who's accountable for the tax policies that starved cities of resources while suburbs flourished?" She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, pulling everyone into her orbit. "You want to talk about failed leadership? Look at the policies that gutted public housing, that left rural and urban communities fighting over scraps. That's the failure we're here to fix." The room erupted in murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Crockett's words were a masterclass in redirection, flipping Vance's attack into a broader indictment of systemic neglect. She reached for her notes, her movements deliberate, and held up a single sheet. "This is a report from your own state, Senator," she said, her voice rising. "It shows rural Ohio families facing eviction at rates rivaling urban centers. So why do you keep pointing fingers at cities like it's their burden alone?" The question was a dagger, and Vance's jaw clenched as the weight of it landed. Crockett wasn't just debating policy. She was exposing the hypocrisy of division, and the room felt it. Vance tried to interject, his voice sharper now. "That's a simplification, Representative. Rural communities don't have the same infrastructure or crime issues." But Crockett cut him off, her hand raised, her presence commanding. "Crime?" she said, her tone laced with incredulity. "You think poverty doesn't breed desperation everywhere? You think rural families aren't struggling with the same fears of losing their homes?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping, to a fierce whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I've seen it, Senator. I've lived it, and I'm done with this game of pitting one against the other." The intensity of her words silenced the room, and even Vance seemed momentarily at a loss. Crockett's personal stake in the fight wasn't just a rhetorical tool. It was a weapon, one she wielded with precision. She turned to the committee chair, her voice steady but urgent. "This hearing isn't about scoring points. It's about people, real people, who are one paycheck away from the street." Then her eyes flicked back to Vance, and her next words were a challenge. "So, Senator, are you here to help them, or are you here to keep playing the blame game?" The question was a gauntlet thrown at his feet, and the room held its breath, waiting for him to pick it up. The hearing room was a pressure cooker, the air heavy with the weight of Representative Jasmine Crockett's challenge to Senator J.D. Vance. Her words, "Are you here to help them, or are you here to keep playing the blame game?" still reverberated, a direct strike that left Vance visibly rattled. His usual polish was fraying, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as he struggled to reclaim the narrative. The audience, from lawmakers to aides, was riveted, their eyes darting between the two combatants. Crockett stood resolute, her challenge a line in the sand, and the room waited for Vance to answer. The stakes were clear. This was no longer just a policy clash but a test of character, and Crockett had seized the moral high ground. Vance's eyes flashed with defiance as he leaned into the microphone, his voice taut with barely contained anger. "Representative Crockett, I'm here for solutions, not theatrics," he said, his words sharp but strained. "You talk about helping people, but your plan dumps billions into systems that have failed for decades. Where's the oversight? Where's the guarantee that this money won't vanish into the same broken pipelines?" He was pivoting, trying to paint Crockett as naive, her passion as reckless idealism. "I care about results, not just feelings," he added, a pointed jab meant to undermine her personal story. The room stirred, some nodding in agreement, but Crockett's supporters bristled at the dismissal. Crockett's expression didn't waver, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury. She took a measured breath, her voice steady but laced with steel. "Senator, you call my lived experience theatrics?" she said, her words slicing through his deflection. "I've stood in the shoes of the people you claim to care about, have you? Because your results sound like excuses to keep the status quo." She leaned forward, her presence commanding the room. "You want oversight? Fine. Let's start with the banks that profited off predatory loans. Let's audit the developers who jack up rents while dodging taxes. Or are we only holding poor communities accountable?" The room erupted in murmurs, her words exposing the double standard. With surgical precision, she held up a thick binder, its pages tabbed and worn. "This is the oversight you're asking for," she said, her voice rising. "Data on every dollar spent on housing in the last decade, urban and rural. It shows the same pattern: underfunding, loopholes, and neglect. You want guarantees? Guarantee me a system that doesn't let families fall through the cracks." Her words were a rallying cry, and the audience was captivated, some clapping before the chair called for order. Vance's face tightened, his earlier confidence eroded by Crockett's relentless logic and moral clarity. She wasn't just debating, she was rewriting the rules of the fight. Vance tried to counter, his voice rising. "You're dodging the issue, Representative. Urban leadership has to answer for—" But Crockett cut him off, her hand raised, her voice a force of nature. "No, Senator, you're dodging," she said, her tone unyielding. "You keep circling back to urban leadership like it's code for something else. Say what you mean, or stop hiding behind it." The accusation was a bombshell, and gasps rippled through the room. Crockett was calling out the subtext of Vance's rhetoric, the unspoken biases that fueled his arguments, and the room felt the weight of it. Even the chair hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Crockett pressed her advantage, her voice dropping to a fierce, deliberate cadence. "I've spent my career fighting for people who've been written off, Senator. Black, brown, white, rural, urban? It doesn't matter. They're all hurting, and they're all watching us right now." She turned to the cameras, her gaze piercing. "They deserve leaders who'll fight for them, not point fingers to score points." The room was electric, her words a clarion call that transcended the hearing. Vance's jaw clenched, his silence deafening as Crockett's truth filled the void. But she wasn't done. She was building to something bigger, and the fire in her eyes promised no retreat. The hearing room was a crucible, charged with the raw power of Representative Jasmine Crockett's words. Her declaration, "They deserve leaders who'll fight for them, not point fingers to score points," had landed like a thunderbolt, leaving Senator J.D. Vance grasping for a response. His silence, heavy and uncharacteristic, betrayed a man outmaneuvered, his jaw tight as he faced the cameras capturing every flicker of discomfort. Crockett's gaze, fierce and unflinching, held the room captive, her call for unity reverberating. in the hearts of those watching. The audience, from lawmakers to the public streaming live, felt the shift. This was no longer a debate, but a reckoning, and Crockett was its architect. She stood poised, ready to deliver the next blow, her fire undimmed. Vance, sensing the tide turning, forced himself to speak, his voice strained but laced with defiance. "Representative Crockett, your rhetoric is compelling, but it doesn't change the facts," he said, his tone sharp. "We can't ignore the inefficiencies in urban housing programs. You're asking for a blank check, and I won't apologize for demanding accountability." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You say you fight for everyone, but your focus is clearly on one demographic. What about the rural families who don't have the same advocacy?" It was a calculated move, an attempt to flip the narrative and paint Crockett as partisan, her universal plea as selective. The room stirred, some nodding, but the accusation felt hollow against her earlier words. Crockett's eyes flashed, her response immediate and razor-sharp. "Senator, don't twist my words to fit your story," she said, her voice a controlled blaze. "I said black, brown, white, rural, urban, because I mean it. You're the one drawing lines, not me." She pointed to the binder on the table, her gesture deliberate. "This data doesn't lie. Rural families in your state are losing homes at the same rate as urban ones. So why are you so fixated on urban inefficiencies? Is it because it's easier to scapegoat certain communities?" The question was a blade, cutting through Vance's deflection, and gasps rippled through the room. Crockett was relentless, exposing the coded language in his argument with surgical precision. She stepped back, her voice rising to fill the space. "Let me tell you about accountability, Senator," she said, her words carrying the weight of lived truth. "Accountability is facing the families who've lost everything and telling them why we let banks and corporations off the hook. Accountability is owning the policies that defunded housing while we bailed out Wall Street." The room was spellbound, her passion a force that transcended politics. She turned to the committee, her tone urgent. "We're not here to play favorites. We're here to fix a system that's broken for everyone. And if you can't see that, Senator, you're not listening to the people you claim to represent." Vance's face reddened, his composure cracking under the onslaught. "That's unfair, Representative," he snapped, his voice rising. "I've fought for rural communities my entire career." But Crockett didn't let him finish. "Then fight for all of them," she interjected, her voice a clarion call. "Stop dividing us to dodge the real issue. The system isn't failing because of urban inefficiencies or rural neglect. It's failing because we've let greed and apathy write the rules." The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling before the chair banged the gavel for order. Crockett's words were a rallying cry, and even Vance's allies looked uneasy, her truth too potent to dismiss. She turned to the cameras again, her voice steady but fierce. "The people watching this, moms, dads, workers, students, they're not asking for handouts. They're asking for a chance to live with dignity." Her eyes locked on Vance, her next words a challenge. "So, Senator, will you stand with them, or will you keep hiding behind excuses?" The question hung in the air, a final gauntlet, and the room braced for his response, knowing the answer could redefine the fight. The hearing room was a tinderbox, Representative Jasmine Crockett's final challenge to Senator J.D. Vance, ringing with unyielding conviction. Her words, "Will you stand with them, or will you keep hiding behind excuses?" pierced the silence, a moral ultimatum that left no room for evasion. Vance's face was a mask of strain, his eyes darting as the weight of the moment pressed down. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of the confrontation, while the audience, lawmakers, staff, and millions watching online, held their breath. Crockett stood tall, her gaze unrelenting, her challenge a beacon of truth in a sea of political maneuvering. This was her moment, and she had turned the hearing into a crucible for justice. Vance gripped the microphone, his knuckles white, his voice tight with defiance. "Representative Crockett, I stand with the people," he said, his words clipped and defensive. "But I won't support reckless spending that buries us in debt without results. You want dignity? Start with fiscal responsibility." It was a last-ditch effort to reclaim authority, to frame Crockett's passion as impractical. He leaned back, forcing a thin smile, but the room felt the hollowness of his response. His words lacked the fire of conviction, and the audience sensed it, murmurs of discontent rippling through the crowd. Crockett's eyes narrowed, her response swift and searing. "Fiscal responsibility?" she said, her voice a controlled inferno. "Tell that to the families sleeping in their cars because we prioritized corporate tax breaks over their homes. You call this reckless? I call it humanity." She slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gavel. "You don't get to lecture about dignity when you're dodging the real fight. The people deserve better than your excuses." The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling as the chair struggled to restore order. Crockett's words were a rallying cry, her moral clarity cutting through Vance's deflections like a blade. She turned to the committee, her voice steady but urgent. "This isn't about debt or bureaucracy. It's about choices, who we choose to protect, who we choose to ignore." She held up her binder, its pages a testament to her preparation. "These numbers show we've failed rural and urban families alike. But we can choose differently. We can rebuild housing, close loopholes, hold profiteers accountable. That's the fight I'm in." Her words were a vision, a call to action that transcended the hearing, and the room felt the shift. Even Vance's allies looked shaken, her truth too powerful to dismiss. Vance opened his mouth to respond, but the chair cut in, sensing the moment's volatility. "We'll move to closing statements," he said, his voice firm. Vance's statement was brief, a reiteration of fiscal caution, but it landed flat, overshadowed by Crockett's fire. When her turn came, she rose, her presence commanding. "I've fought for people my whole life," she said, her voice resonant. "Not for votes, not for headlines, but because I know their pain. Today, I'm asking you, all of you, to fight. With me. For every family, every community, every person who deserves a home." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Let's make that choice together." The room exploded in applause, lawmakers and spectators rising to their feet. Vance sat motionless, his silence a concession. As the hearing adjourned, Crockett's words spread like wildfire online, clips of her testimony going viral. Her message, unity, accountability, humanity, sparked a national conversation, galvanizing activists and citizens to demand housing equity. Vance's narrative crumbled under the weight of her truth, his accusations exposed as divisive and hollow. Crockett emerged not just victorious but transformative, her legal genius and lived experience reshaping the fight for justice. The people had been heard, and the path forward was clear: a shared struggle, a shared solution, and a leader who would never back down.